Now, as far as substitution, you do not want to substitute wool with alpaca. Wool has that wonderful elasticity that helps it hold its shape in all of those seamless garments. Alpaca does not have that. It is an animal fiber like wool, but that's kind of where the similarities end. Alpaca is going to have beautiful drape, but it doesn't have that elasticity. It's not going to hold its shape like wool does. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting is a form of self-care, that you can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies, but still create beautiful garments that you love to wear. And part of learning to create those beautiful garments is how to properly substitute different yarns, because let's face it, a lot of the time we don't use the yarn that's recommended in the pattern. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I would say that most people don't. I don't know, we should do a poll about that, I think. But a lot of the time we want to substitute for whatever reason. Perhaps the yarn used in the pattern is very expensive. We want to use something more budget friendly, or perhaps it's an inexpensive yarn and we really want to splurge and use some really quality fiber that we've been saving for that special project. Or perhaps you're allergic to a fiber that's used in that yarn, so you want to use something else. Whatever the reason, you want to use something you already have in your stash. So many reasons for substituting. And we discussed how to properly substitute in our last knit and chat. I will link that down below. It covers, I think, the 4 or 5 different things you have to consider when you're choosing one yarn as a substitute for another. And one of those things that we talked about was the fibers used in that yarn. So I thought we would dive a little more deeply into that topic, and this week explore those protein fibers, or animal fibers. And then in our next knit and chat next month, we would discuss the cellulose fibers or plant fibers. Those are the two bigger categories. There's also synthetic fibers, which are like your acrylics, which is basically you can substitute acrylic in most cases for any of the other yarns that you want to use, or synthetics, I should say. Acrylics are a good replacement for wool. Then there's like polyester, which is a good replacement for your plant fibers, because it has that lovely silky drape. And then nylon, of course, which is used for the elasticity like in your socks. And then the other category is also biosynthetic, which is plant fiber. It takes a more synthetic process to become usable yarn. So I'm gonna lump that one in with our plant fibers. And I don't think we really need a whole video about acrylic yarn and synthetic yarns, because I feel like they're easier to use. Let me know if you think we should discuss them in more detail in a whole knit and chat, and maybe we can do that in the future. But I thought we would cover the other two, animal fibers and plant fibers, or protein and cellulose as they are referred to. But I just think it's easier to remember animal and plant. Now, as an aside, before we get to our talk about all of these animal fibers, I want to mention this yarn bowl beside me. If you saw one of my notions videos, I've done a few, I talk about the notions and tools that I don't use. Top of my list was a yarn bowl. And as you can see, I'm using it today. That is because while I'm sitting here and knitting with you, I realized that my yarn can sit there while I'm talking to you. And it works very well. Most of the time I'm knitting all over the house, and I prefer to have my projects in their own bags, and I knit straight from the bag. I don't carry a yarn bowl around with me. But when I'm sitting in one spot like this, it's perfect. So if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it down below. If you have, then feel free to laugh at me in the comments, because I did say that I don't use a yarn bowl, but lo and behold, I am using one now while I talk to you. Now we're just going to cover these animal fibers in sort of broad strokes. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each one, but if you want to explore them even further, I have some articles on my website. I'll link to one that sort of has a list of all of them, and it also includes information like the types of projects you might want to knit with that particular fiber, how to care for that fiber, and other information like that. So we'll take a more of a broad overview, because there are a lot of fibers and we'd be here for a long time if we really dove deep into each of them. So we'll start with, of course, the most popular, wool. Now, even within this one category of wool, we have different sheep breeds. And all of these different sheep breeds create different types of fiber. Like, they're all wool, but they are all completely different. The crimp is different, the micron count, the staple length. You can explore all of that. Especially if you're a spinner, you probably know a lot about that. I know the words and enough to get myself into trouble trying to understand it, but not enough to really explain it well. But all of these different sheep breeds produce different types of wool and they will feel different as you're knitting with them and as you're wearing them. You could have a nice soft merino wool that's really soft and nice against the skin. You can knit a lovely Lopi sweater or Fair Isle sweater with those types of yarn that are generally used for those projects. It's going to be more scratchy, not going to feel so great against your skin, but it's going to produce a sweater that's really warm. Now merino, on the other hand, isn't as warm as those yarns, but it's nice and soft against the skin. So we've got, even within wool itself, we have different properties based on just the fibers in that particular breed of sheep. And that's something we can't discuss today. We'd be here all day again if we just broke down all of these different sheep breeds and the types of fiber they produce. But I think it's one of those skills, the more different yarns you use, the more you start to understand the different nature for each of these. And of course, how those yarns are spun works with this as well. But that's another completely different topic that we're not going to focus on. But we've got our wool. So we'll say that. And they all have they share the same advantages, even though there are some differences, even among the different sheep breeds. They all have some basic advantages they all share. And the first is the elasticity or the memory of the yarn, where those fibers can be stretched out, but they bounce back into shape and they want to hold a particular shape, which is great when you are knitting, especially seamless garments. I know everybody loves their top-down sweaters, yokes and raglans, but there's no seams. And that can be trouble with some different fibers, but with wool, it's not an issue because of this natural elasticity and memory that wool has. And of course, different breeds of sheep are going to have different amounts of elasticity. I couldn't tell you which ones have more and which ones have less, but it can vary from one breed to another. But in general, wool has that elasticity and that memory. It wants to hold its shape. So if you knit that top-down sweater without seams, instead of getting saggy and baggy like if you knit it with a cotton yarn, which doesn't have any elasticity, wool, on the other hand, wants to hold its shape. And along with that, the fibers in your wool yarns, except for superwash, we'll say untreated wool, they want to stick to each other. There's those little scales on each of the fibers, and they hug the other scales on the other fibers, and that's part of what helps it hold its shape, is all those scales hugging each other. So all the different fibers are sticking close together. When you take a superwash, you either burn those scales off or you sort of coat them so they don't want to stick together. So a superwash isn't a good substitute for an untreated wool because of that, because it doesn't act the same. It doesn't have those scales anymore that like to stick together. And that means it almost acts more like a plant fiber, where it's got nice and slick and beautiful and drapey, but doesn't have quite the same elasticity and memory as wool because of those scales aren't able to stick together like they are in wool. Now, wool is also a pretty lightweight fiber, and I think that helps also with this top-down seamless garment. Is it's not as heavy as other fibers, so you're not asking that garment without seams, because you need seams for structure, and if you don't have those, then you've got to have structure somewhere, so you want a good yarn that was going to hold that structure, like wool. And because it's more lightweight, especially when compared with a lot of plant fibers, then it can help with that as well. Now, of course, this varies from yarn to yarn, like the way they're spun. Like if you have like a single ply Lopi yarn, it's really light and lofty and airy, compared to like a 3-ply tightly spun yarn. You could have 200 gram skeins and you're going to have a lot more yardage in the Lopi yarn because it's more lightweight. So you'll find variety with how it's spun, but in general, wool yarns are lightweight, especially when it's compared with like the plant fiber counterparts. Wool is also very warm and it's a good insulator. And this is because if you think it's just hair, and hair usually, it's like it's got, I don't even know all the proper terms. It's like a hollow tube. It's got a cortex, and air gets trapped within that. So when you've got it all knit up in a sweater, you've got like air getting trapped in there, and it's keeping you warm, but it can still be lightweight. And I don't understand all of it, but let's just say it's lightweight and it's warm because the air gets trapped, especially if you have like that lopey yarn where it's lightly spun. You've got more space for all that air to get trapped in. So it insulates your body and keeps you nice and warm. And that's why those sweaters, while you wouldn't want to wear them right next to your skin, are super nice on cold days. You can almost like skip wearing a coat because these sweaters are just so warm. Wool is also, it absorbs water. So it won't make you feel like it can get wet on the outside, but it sort of holds it away from you. So you're not going to feel like you're soaking wet. Another neat thing about wool is that it doesn't hold odors. I think that's just really cool. Like, you don't have to wash your sweater every time you wear it, which is good because, I mean, washing and drying your clothes all the time, it's wear and tear on the clothes and they just break down faster. So wool, because it doesn't hold odors, means you don't have to wash it as much as you might for other things, especially if you wear something underneath. I like to wear like sometimes like some kind of shirt underneath, especially for my underarm area, because of course that's usually the first place you're going to start getting smelly. And if you can block that a little, then that can even help your sweaters last longer. Like, you could refresh them perhaps with a handheld steamer, or I've even heard in like Scandinavian countries, they'll have a fresh snowfall, so they'll put their sweaters in the snow and that snow refreshes the sweater. So there's no need to wash your wool every time you wear it because it doesn't hold on to odors like other, especially synthetic fibers do. So that's another nice bonus. I know in most cases, my handful of wool sweaters, I might wash partway through winter, and then I'll wash them all at the end of the season before I pack them away. Unless that, I mean, if I have, like, I don't think I have any that I wear a ton. No, I have one cardigan that I sort of sits on my chair and I wear a lot. And that one I probably could stand to wash a little more often just because it gets sort of worn every day, sort of like a house coat. I just throw it on when I'm cold. But in general, they don't hold on to odors. So unless you're getting stains on them, you don't have to wash them as much as you do your other clothing. Now, the last two things, wool is very receptive to dye. So of course we get all of these lovely colors, and it's also flame retardant, which is pretty cool. Like, if wool gets somehow like set on fire, it sort of self-extinguishes. Again, unlike acrylics, which will melt when they have too much heat, or plant fibers. Plant fibers burn like paper. So wool is one of those fibers. I don't know if all animal fibers are like this, but wool at least is a self-extinguishing fiber. It's a flame retardant. Now, as much as we love wool, there are some disadvantages as well. It gets weaker when it's wet. That's why if you're hand washing your sweaters, you have to be very careful when you're moving them or squeezing out the water not to stretch them out. And it can be scratchy. Some yarns or fibers can be more scratchy than others. Some fibers can be a lot more expensive than others. And one more, what was the other one? Oh, it can felt, of course, which can be an advantage or a disadvantage. Advantage if you want it to felt, not so good if you don't want your project to felt. So it has to be taken care of carefully, like hand washing or on a very gentle cycle, not too much agitation or any at all, to keep that from felting. And different breeds of wool, or sheep, I should say, will also felt at different rates. And that's also an experiment I have never tried, so I couldn't tell you which ones will felt more than others. But there are some disadvantages to wool. Then we have alpaca, which is a very, very popular yarn for good reason, but I'm going to sort of put it in with the other fibers in the camelid family because they all sort of go together. So camel, llama, alpaca, vicuña. They're all sort of in the same related family. Now, camel and llama, not as common. You can find them occasionally. Most of the time, it's the coarser fibers on those animals are used in things like upholstery, but occasionally you can find yarns with camel and llama. Then, of course, vicuña, which is in like a category all by itself, but it's within this camelid family, so they all sort of share the same advantages and disadvantages. But because it's protected species in South America and it's not like they're wild animals that they capture maybe once every 2 or 3 years to gather the fleece, it's not common because it's very expensive. Someday I'd like to get my hands on a skein just to try it out. But beautifully soft yarn, softer than the other ones in this same grouping, but the other properties are pretty much the same. And then of course you have alpaca. And the alpaca can be divided into 2 different types of alpaca. The huacaya alpaca, if your yarn label just says alpaca, it's probably this type. And then there is the Surrey alpaca. So if your yarn has Surrey alpaca, which is softer than the Huacaya, then it's probably going to say right on the label that it's a Surrey alpaca specifically. So if it doesn't say Surrey, then it's going to be this other kind. It's not a bad yarn, just might not be as soft as the Surrey yarn. So the advantages for the camelid family fibers is that they're very soft and warm, very light and airy, almost too warm. If you've ever knit 100% alpaca sweater, I have not, but I've heard of other people who have, and the major comment I always hear from them is that it's like leaning into too warm. Like you can only wear it on the super coldest days because it's just too warm. So I think that's why it's good blended with other fibers, because you get that extra warmth. You don't want to lean into that too warm category, because then you can't wear that sweater too much if it's just going to make you be overheated. That's because the fibers in these animals, they have that hollow tube core in the center of the fibers, and then all that warm air gets trapped in there, and it's just very warm fiber. Now it's also water resistant, and it's one of those lanolin free fibers. So if lanolin is an issue from wool for you, then alpaca is not a perfect substitute. We're going to get to that in a second, but a good thing to consider. It also has really beautiful drape, so it's great for things where you want drape, like a shawl or something like that. But this also leads into the biggest disadvantages with its lack of elasticity. That sort of goes along with the drape. It's got this lovely drape because even those fibers, they don't stick together like wool, and they're not elastic like wool. So think of like your wool like an elastic band. It can stretch, but then it wants to go back into its shape, that shape that you've created in your sweater. It wants to hold that shape. Alpaca doesn't want to do that. It wants to drape and flow, and it doesn't want to stick to its neighbors beside it. So you get that lovely drape when you want it, but you might get that lovely drape when you don't want it. If you've knit a seamless sweater, the alpaca fiber is not going to hold its shape like wool. It's going to continue to drape and drape and drape. And after a while, drape just becomes sag, and it doesn't look as good as you would hoped, even though you knit with this beautiful alpaca yarn. So that's the biggest disadvantage, is it does not have the elasticity of wool. So you cannot replace alpaca for a wool in a yarn substitution. You could add it. It could certainly be part of a yarn, and it will add that wonderful softness and that drape and that warmth, but be cautious of knitting a seamless sweater with 100% alpaca yarn. Now, a seamed sweater, the seams are going to give it structure. It'd be great in a shawl or other projects where the drape is prized. But when you want your garment to hold its shape, alpaca is not your go-to fiber. So our next yarn is Mohair, which comes from the Angora goat. And if you have been knitting for the last few years, then you probably have seen multiple people knit sweaters with using a strand of mohair held with another yarn to get that lovely halo effect in their sweater. Super popular thing. It has been for a couple years. Maybe it's on its way out. I don't know. I've never been one to do trends, but I'm knitting one now. So I just bought some mohair because I wanted to knit one of those light fluffy sweaters for myself to see what it's like, since I've never knit one before. But anyway, mohair comes from the Angora goat. Now the fleece from the older goats is generally more coarse and not as fine, so that's not really used for yarn. It's usually saved for like industries like upholstery. But what we use for yarn is from the younger goats. So as they age out, then it's not yarn, it's not suitable yarn for knitting anymore. And of course, the most prized is kid mohair, which is what you often find like in these brushed fibers, like in this yarn, and it's very, very soft. But sometimes you get one, I have had some before, where it's more scratchy. So I mean, it depends on the yarn brand and the particular mohair that's used, I suppose. So you often find it like this, where you find it brushed, so it has sort of this halo effect, and you get that halo in whatever project you're knitting, like all of these sweaters where you're holding it double with another yarn. But it's also less feltable, it's less likely to felt than wool, so that can be an advantage. Of course, you're still going to want to take a gentle care of your project, but it's less likely to felt compared to wool. So mohair is very lightweight like wool, and it's also receptive to dye like wool. It has really good drape like alpaca. It's also very warm like alpaca. Similar to that, it has like sort of those air pockets inside the individual fibers, so it makes it very, very warm. And now for disadvantages, it is less resilient than wool. It's not as elastic as wool is. I think it's probably a little better than alpaca though, but I'm not sure. It can feel prickly depending on the type of mohair you get. I've gotten some before where, you know, I do that hold it to my neck test. This one feels soft and lovely, but I've had some before that felt scratchy. I did not like it. And so if you run into that issue, try to get a kid mohair and try that out to see if it's better. It can be expensive, the mohair yarns, of course, that's another disadvantage. Also more difficult to frog because, especially if it's one of these brushed fibers, because they want to stick together. So if you have to like take your project apart and you want to use the yarn for something else, then I have heard it recommended, I haven't tried it myself, that if you put it in the freezer first, then that can help with unraveling the project. So I haven't tested that, but I have heard that recommended by others who knit something with mohair and then wanted to take it apart. And the last thing, it can also shed, especially if it's more lightly spun, then you might be shedding more bits of fiber as you walk around in your sweater. Then we have silk, which is probably one of my favorites. I love how smooth it is and that slight sheen it gives to projects. This yarn right here is a silk yak fingering. It's a blend of superwash merino and silk and yak yarn. Yak, which we're not going to discuss. I think it might be in one of my articles, which I've linked down below. But there's just too many fibers to talk about. But silk is definitely one of my favorites. I love it in the summer for like a nice drapey top. I love it when it's added to like my wool yarns for my winter sweaters, because I just love like that little bit of sheen it gives the fibers and the drape that it adds. But of course, I mean, it comes from silkworms, the cocoon of the silkworm. So they can be harvested from the wild. They can be like fed a special diet of mulberry leaves. That's where we get mulberry silk. And then they are, of course, the cocoon itself is what the silk comes from, is from the cocoon. And they're generally, they boil the cocoons with the moths in there. So it kills the moths, and then the cocoons are turned into silk. They can also, there are other lower grades of silk technically, where they wait for the moths to escape the cocoon and then they take the broken cocoons and turn it into silk. So it's a whole process. We will not discuss the ethics of silkworms and silkworm death when it comes to silk. Now, silk fibers are very, very smooth. I think that's why I like them so much. I just love the feel of that smoothness. And that means that they slide past each other. So they have really lovely drape. They don't stick together like other animal fibers do. And they're not prone to pilling either for the same reason. And I love that luster and sheen that silk has. It's also a very strong fiber. It takes dye really well, but it can start to fade. It's also a really good insulator. I'm not sure why. I'm sure there's sciencey things behind that, but according to the things I've read about it, silk is good at insulating as well. It does have some disadvantages though. First of all, even though it takes dye very well, it does tend to fade. So you want to be careful with that, or keep that in mind when you are knitting a project or choosing your colors for your project. It's also very weak when it's wet. So you have to treat it very gently. You don't want things to stretch out. So you have to treat your projects gently when they are wet. The fibers are also very heavy in relation to other animal fibers, which you think they are hairs, the other ones. So they have all these hollow centers. They're more lightweight. Silk, of course, is not a hair spun from a cocoon. So it's missing that hollow center, which would make it more lightweight. So it's heavier than these other fibers. It's not very elastic either. If you think with all the other, they're hairs, so they want to stick together. This doesn't. Silk strands are smooth and slippery and they want to slide past each other, so it doesn't hold its shape or elasticity like other fibers, other animal fibers do. And of course, it's also an expensive fiber. Next is cashmere, which is of course a very popular and luxurious yarn. It's collected from the cashmere or the pashmina goats, which are native to the Himalayas. These goats are combed, and it's the undercoat that is used for the yarn. And the fibers are very short and very fine, which makes a very, very soft yarn, but also makes it hard to spin into a usable fiber. So you end up with a yarn that is very light and airy and delicate, which is lovely for the right projects. But if you've ever had a 100% cashmere sweater, then you probably noticed it was very quick to pill because these fibers are so soft and so short that it's hard to spin them into a yarn that will hold its shape. So that's one of the major advantages of it, though, is that it's so extremely soft. Like, that's why people love these sweaters from 100% cashmere, is because they are such soft fibers. Now, these fibers are also very resilient, and they are actually warmer than sheep's wool. So if you want to add some cashmere, then you're going to get that extra warmth. And they're very receptive to dye, so you can get lots of lovely colors in that cashmere fiber. Now, there are a couple disadvantages. Of course, there's the expense. Cashmere is very expensive. And it's also, because it's so soft and it's hard to spin into a yarn, a sturdy yarn, you get a lot of pilling, because you can't get like that tight twist like you can on a lot of other fibers, because those fibers are so short. So you get the pilling. You have lovely softness, but with that comes this drawback of pilling as well. And cashmere is also weaker than wool, and I'm guessing it's because of this same thing, where it's so soft and fine and short fibers, that the fibers they're weaker when they're spun together than other wools, which might have longer staple lengths as well. Now, these are some of the more popular fibers, but there are actually other animal fibers, but this video would be super long if we just went over every single one. There is yak and bison and kiviot and angora, and I'm sure there's others that we could add to that list. I would consider a lot of those more luxury yarns. You don't see them as much as the ones we've just discussed, but I do have more information about them at that article I've linked down below if that's something you want to learn more about. But understanding these different properties from the fibers is just one piece of this larger picture of yarn substitution. So if you want to learn more about those different rules about substituting one yarn for another for your next knitting project, you're going to want to check out this video right here. Click right there, and I'll see you in the next video.